everyone. My name's Linda Magid, and I am the owner of Pilates for Real Bodies, an online mat Pilates studio. And as a fitness instructor, I am always interested in new information that's coming out that tells us that by doing strength training and cardiorespiratory exercise, we can live a longer life with a higher quality of life. And a new study has come out that I got very interested in, and I reached out to Jessica Gorzelitz, who's kind enough to and have this conversation so that you too can learn why you should be exercising. Thank you so much, Jessica, for coming on and meeting with me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and where you work and what you do?
So I am currently an assistant professor of health promotion at the University of Iowa. And I have a background in both kinesiology, which is exercise science, human movement, but I additionally have training in physical activity epidemiology. I've done those trainings at the University of Wisconsin, also at the National Cancer Institute, and I have trained at MD Anderson Cancer Center.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I see that you really care about animals and that you volunteered with a Dogs on Call. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, you might hear my little urchin under my desk right now. I'm a big dog person. So when I was training, when I was in school at Wisconsin, I was a volunteer for the Dogs on Call program. So that was actually a therapy dog program. We had individuals with their own personal dogs, and they were the handlers. These are just certified good boys and girls. And we would go around and visit patients in the hospital. This was pre-pandemic. But healthcare, being in the hospitals, can be really isolating and sad. People miss their dogs at home, especially if they're there for longer durations. So we would just take a few hours out of our week and go visit and just talk to people, ask about their pets. And we would also visit with staff because, they miss their pets during long durations. But yeah, dogs are a huge part of my life, as is exercise. So I kind of follow my passions into my work.
What brought you to the field of cancer research?
So when I was growing up, I lost both my grandfather and my uncle to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was really tough for our family. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized there was association, or I learned that there was an association between exercise or physical activity and cancer risk. So it was something, my family's been really important to me, and seeing the effect that cancer journey had on our family, it's kind of always been a passion of mine. So being able to, again, leverage my passion and interest in exercise into such a terrible disease like cancer and try to make the world a slightly better place by understanding, using my research skills to understand how exercise can be helpful.
Well, I really appreciate that. My mom is a cancer survivor twice over breast cancer. And of course, watching her go through her surgeries and everything, of course, was very difficult. But for the people who are fortunate to survive, the recovery can be really hard. And having that information of
Yes.
knowing how you can maintain a healthy life,
Quality of
I
life,
personally appreciate that.
function, right? Like longevity, like all of those things, clinically, individuals care a lot about that survival, right? The yes or no alive, which ironically is what this paper is focused on, but that loses almost the totality of the picture of what the human's experiencing.
Just give us an overall understanding of the research that you did, what you looked for, who was in it, and what you found.
Yeah. So this type of study is considered epidemiology, which is becoming increasingly common now in the COVID era. But basically, what we can do is take large groups of people in something called a cohort. So take a group of individuals, ask them about a whole bunch of things, and follow them up over time to see what happens. So we call this a prospective cohort. The study that we used was about 100,000 individuals that were assessed on multiple factors. For this study, we cared a lot about aerobic exercise, so running, jogging, those types of things that cause you to be sweaty and get your heart rate up, and then also weightlifting. So in particular, we looked at those two items, how much people were exercising. We followed them up for about a decade. And I should add, these people were about 70 years old when we asked them about their exercise behaviors, followed them up for a decade, and we could see those who passed away and those who did not, and sort of look back and compare how those exercise behaviors impacted their risk of death about a decade later.
And how many times did you check in with them over the course of the study?
So this is one of the limitations of this sample size. We know that it was just at that one time point. So we asked that baseline, what is typical for the individual, or what have you done in the last 30 days? We trust what people tell us in terms of self-report, what is usual for them, but it was one measure over a 10-year decade.
So go ahead if you can and tell me about the results of the study, what you found.
Yeah, so with this analysis, we looked at death. That was the main thing we wanted to look at. And the main finding was that both aerobic exercise and weightlifting were linked to lower risks of death, which I think is the main outcome. But the interesting finding was that both aerobic exercise alone or weightlifting alone were helpful for lowering risk of death. Sometimes people can adopt an all or nothing mindset that I should only run or do aerobic exercise, or I should only lift weights or do other muscle strengthening exercise. But in fact, in our study, the people with the lowest risk of death were actually those who did both, consistent with the federal activity guidelines. So all Americans are supposed to do 2.5 hours per week or 150 minutes of at least moderate intensity physical activity. And then additionally, which people often forget about, is the muscle strengthening guideline. We should be doing 2 days a week of progressive muscle strengthening activities for the entire body, at least 2 days per week. So we looked at weightlifting, which absolutely counts, but weightlifting doesn't capture everything, like Pilates, for example.
The overall message of weight training or strength training is a good sign itself.
Yeah.
If you're doing it, you're going to be helping yourself, and don't go do something that you don't enjoy that you're going to end up not doing because you don't enjoy it.
Yes, so 100%. It has to be sustainable. These studies that I do, these epi studies that like better understand the association, is a different question than how do you get people to continue to do it, which is actually the main thing. And all of those activities have benefit. One of the most consistent findings we see in our discipline in physical activity epidemiology is that some is better than none and more is better. The worst group to be in is that group that doesn't do anything. So even if it's a little bit more than last week, even if it's a couple steps more than yesterday, it has to be a forward progression.
Tell me about the results regarding cancer morbidity and strength and cardio.
So in our study, we looked at 3 different outcomes or 3 different measurement endpoints. So we had all-cause mortality, which basically is death from any cause. We have cardiovascular disease mortality. These are things, sort of relevant to like a stroke or a heart attack or something that affects the cardiovascular system. And then we also looked at cancer-specific mortality. So again, when we look at those specific outcomes for cardiovascular disease and cancer, we are relying on the death certificate for the coroner to tell us cause of death in order to analyze that. So there's always the potential for misclassification there. But what we found with our results, we analyzed our data separately to sort of look at the effect of aerobic exercise. We looked at weightlifting exercise separately, and then we combined the two. So when we look at aerobic exercise reduced risk of all 3 outcomes. So cardio is good it lowers all-cause mortality, it lowers cancer and cardiovascular disease. When we adjusted for weightlifting alone was associated with all 3 of those outcomes. So weightlifting alone lowered your risk for all-cause mortality, lowered for cancer mortality, lowered for cardiovascular disease. But when we adjusted for both of those factors, so when we put aerobic exercise and we added weightlifting to our statistical models, that was only associated with lower all-cause and cardiovascular disease specific mortality. So again, with that result, it doesn't mean that weightlifting is risky or aerobic exercise is risky. We just sort of lost that statistical association. Sometimes that can be due to many different statistical factors. One of the reasons could be that if we separate out by cancer type, or we look at different groups of people, so breast cancer versus prostate cancer, for example, there's always the potential we need more follow-up or a longer time to see until these people actually pass away from their cancer disease. So to be honest, it was kind of a surprising finding. A few other studies have looked at that umbrella term, so looking at muscle strengthening activities in cancer outcomes. And when individuals look at all muscle strengthening activities, they've shown that that's associated with lower cancer mortality. So my study isn't necessarily consistent with that. So the analysis I'm working on currently is using the same data from this study, but we're going to look at the results a little more with more sophistication, kind of looking at the treatment variables, right? Like chemo versus radiation, where we have them. We also want to look at time since diagnosis, because that can certainly influence mortality outcomes. And the big thing for me is we want to look at site-specific disease. So again, it's tough to compare. When we look at all cancer mortality, we're lumping melanoma in with breast, with lung cancer, which have 3 very different survival trajectories. So I'm excited to elucidate that, to look at that relationship further, because I don't think the story is fully there yet. But again, weightlifting is one specific type of muscle strengthening activity. We know overall muscle strengthening activity is good, but really pushing this weightlifting question.
You talked a little bit already about how your study was limited, and then in the study itself, you talk about it. Can you bring that up, like in terms of race and ethnicities that you looked at?
So in these types of study designs, we talk about the findings, what does it mean, and or how generalizable are the results. And for these types of studies, they're only generalizable to the people who are represented in the study. In the cohort that we analyzed, it's incredibly white. I think it was something like 96% individuals who self-identified as white, which is not representative of the entire US population. This is something that we really struggle with in epidemiology, especially with the older cohorts that may have been started like 30 years ago. Convenience sampling was a thing. Asking people who were close to universities or who trusted universities or who we knew would participate in studies has led to a lot of representation of individuals who are white. There's also a historic lack of trust for certain communities due to a lot of harm that's been imposed on certain people. There's the Tuskegee syphilis study. There have been other historical travesties inflicted on people of color in the name of science or in the name of healthcare. I read a piece about gynecologic oncology and some of the horrific experiments that were done on women who were enslaved to sort of be the foundation of gynecologic oncology. And these women were tortured. So it's not surprising. I mean, it's really disappointing, quite honestly, that we have such poor representation, but it's not surprising that there has been a lack of representation, because we have a bunch of white people in the academy who keep doing the same studies. I don't want to perpetuate these studies. We made that very clear in our limitations section of the paper, that this is a known limitation. And I know there are several groups across the country that are working on more inclusive practices and really starting to look at the specific health effects and recruit people of color. I think there's a couple of groups, like one's out of Boston. There's the Black Women's Health Study. There are a few others that I'm blanking on, but representation is a huge thing, right? We can't say that this works for everybody when we don't include everybody.
So Jess, can you tell me anything more about the study? How is interesting, something that's different about it?
One thing I like to point out, that to my knowledge, this is the first study to look at weightlifting as a unique behavior. I've talked a little bit about muscle strengthening exercise broadly, but this is looking at weightlifting as a unique behavior. We're talking weights and, iron and barbells. And it was actually my dad who got me interested in weightlifting when I was in middle school. So that paradigm has very much followed with me. When I was studying the literature to kind of understand what's been done, it seems that there is not really a great representation of women who study muscle strengthening activity. There have been historically a lot of men who study this, who are leaders in the field, but not a lot of women who study weightlifting or muscle strengthening activity. So I'm really honored to have this contribution to the literature, to put my name on it and to start to advance my career. I'm very early, but this is something that is very important for me to not only represent my identity as a powerlifter, which is from my dad, but then also as a woman, that this just shouldn't be a boys' club, that we deserve a place at the table too, and to be represented.
I've really come to the end of my questions. Is there anything that you want to add?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks again for speaking to me about this. It's been really great to talk about my research. This is just one study that is against the totality of evidence. There's two things I like to point out, and just in summary, we've talked about one already. The association is very clear that some is better than none and more is better. So I very much identify with your mission of getting people healthy. I think strengthening exercises have been historically underrepresented. So making sure that that some does include some strength training. One of the little quirks of our study too was, it's buried in the paper, but we did find an influence of the role of sex. So we did see that weightlifting was beneficial for both men and women, but actually the association was stronger for women than men. In epidemiology, it's called effect modification. But again, both sexes benefited, but it was stronger in women. One of the challenges with this type of study is we can't know for sure why, but we can tell you that it did occur. I think in promoting strengthening exercises like weightlifting for women is particularly important, especially since we go through the menopausal transition. We live longer than men, and that when we go through those transitions and those changes, that our lean tissue can really degrade a lot faster than for men. So in order to maintain that functional independence and just central to your mission, not just living longer, but living better is key.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for adding that. Given how much women's bodies lose muscle mass and bone mass, and we know that weightlifting increases both muscle mass and bone mass, it really is essential for women to be doing through their whole lives, but especially to continue to do it as we age and as we go through menopause. So thank you for adding that. This has been such a great conversation. I am so excited about this study and to read about it, and just to keep people excited and motivated to exercise. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thanks again, Linda. I'm always happy to talk about the importance of exercise and science.
Thank you.